Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We will be starting in just a few moments once we see the attendee number starting to plateau.
All right, is my cam?
We can see you.
Okay, great. I wasn't sure. I can't see the whole. Go to view. There we go. Well, that's weird. It has me listed as twice.
All right. Okay, well, I believe we are a minute in. So since we have so much to cover this morning, let's get started. First of all, thank you all for joining us today for PSC's May webinar, all about packaging legislation. I'm really excited to be discussing this very big topic. I think we could be discussing this for well over an hour, and I'm hoping we can at least begin to scratch the surface for today's topics and understanding where you can go after this to learn a little bit more about what's happening in the packaging legislation space as it applies to the pet industry. So without further ado, to introduce myself to start, my name is Allie Bowden. I am the Senior Packaging Program Manager here at PSC, and will be serving as today's moderator and very briefly as a speaker to talk about some of our PSC tools. But I'm really excited, more importantly, to be also introducing our speakers today. We have Tracy Sutton, Sarah Jane Widdowson, Hannah Worthington joining us from Root. For those of you that might have joined us for our packaging webinar series in the fall, this past fall, you may recognize Tracy and Sarah Jane from our past legislation webinar, and we're really excited to have them join us today. Just some housekeeping items before I forget. Please use the Q&A box to ask any questions that you have throughout today's webinar. We have some time dedicated to the later half to address them. So as they come up in your brain and you want to make sure they're written down somewhere, please use that box. And also, if by chance you see a question that you'd also like to see answered, there is, or should be at least, a little thumbs up type of button next to questions that appear, and that will allow you to upvote a question to really add emphasis that you'd like to see it asked as well. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsors for today's webinar. We have both Fanfu and Alstrom who have helped support this webinar today. And I'd like to hand it off to Daryl from Fanfu to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Allie. This subject is really important, or there wouldn't be over 100 attendees being proactive in understanding this ever-changing and ever-increasing legislation. This webinar does provide an overview of current directives. Several states have enacted legislation, with more considering what their next steps will be. Europe recently made changes that will affect anyone shipping packaged products there, some of whom are PSC members. Perhaps you've been thinking about a more sustainable packaging format, or have even started to honestly talk about it. In a relatively short period, we will have no choice but to address sustainability and environmental issues. So why not start today on a well thought out timeline so that you're prepared for these changes? Fanfu, an accredited member of PSC, is pleased to co-sponsor this event. I'm honored to work with a company that doesn't merely talk about it, having developed the VelaFlex monomaterial 8 years ago, because it was the right thing to do. We produce a proven third-party validated recyclable solution that's PFAS free and has earned the ISCC Plus certification, which allows us to include PCR materials that are suitable for direct food contact. In our newest plant, rainwater is recycled and used for non-production applications. Our 2 solar installations provide 25% of our electrical needs as we continue to make changes that are more environmentally friendly, including now being a toluene-free company. Because we produce all packaging films from base resins and don't rely on others to produce films for us, we can build a solution that's best suited for you. This includes our high barrier applications. We need to join together and make a difference for a better environment for our children and grandchildren. I'd like to thank you, and let's get started. And I'll pass it over to Amy Cohen.
All right. Thank you. Ahlstrom is proud to be a accredited supplier of the PSC and co-sponsoring this event. EPR legislation for single-use packaging has begun in Europe and North America. Pet food brands need to be proactive and implement changes to minimize costs. While with another company, I experienced the negative impact from being uninformed or slow to respond. It can stop production, incur fines, and lawsuits. Can you say California? Because yes, we did go through that. Questions you should be asking yourself as you're thinking about this topic is, what are your company's goals? What is your timeline? What end-of-life story do you want for your brand? What new solutions are you looking for? Ahlstrom is a global leader in fiber-based technology. We're on a mission to replace single-use plastic packaging where possible with fiber-based materials. We supply the materials to the converters that produce the packaging. Paper has a proven circular economy. We offer products with high grease resistance without the use of PFAS chemicals and MVTR properties to assure that the product shelf life requirements are met. Our materials have passed WMU for curbside recyclable. Paper-based technology can really complement your total packaging portfolio. Ahlstrom is really looking to drive the conversation to brands, to the converter. We build relationships with brands to identify the fiber-based needs for the future. We welcome the opportunity to discuss fiber-based solutions with your company and how it can complement your current sustainable packaging goals. Thank you for your time and looking forward to this webinar. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you both, Daryl and Amy, for joining us today and helping sponsor this. And for all those words about the emphasis of legislation today. So before I hand it off to Root to really talk about the packaging legislation landscape, I wanted to take a moment to at least highlight something really exciting happening actually as of today, and that is the launch of a packaging legislation tracker that has now been added to our toolkit on our website, which will be actually linked in just a moment here. But just to show you what that looks like, and I encourage you maybe as some homework after today to take a gander. I'd like to show you what this exciting tool provides, but also I will say as a caveat, it can be a little overwhelming. And that's why I'm really excited to have Root here today to, decompress after what I'm about to show you. So the packaging legislation tracker can be downloaded through the link that was just provided in the chat here. And upon download, this should be the main view you see. There are some basic instructions of how to utilize the legislation tracker, but just to kind of provide a little broad brush overview of what this all looks like. This tool provides a comprehensive list of packaging related regulations for the pet industry and how they and help you at least piece together how it could apply to you in your where you are in the pet industry or with the type of packaging you work with. The 4 regions we have represented thus far include the US, Canada, and the EU. We will be updating this on a biannual basis. So mid-April was the last update, and we intend on doing another big update in mid-October. So keep in mind that in this ever-changing landscape, that there could be some information outdated, but at least there are resources to find further information. Upon our next update, our intention is to expand upon the EU to include more non-EU countries, as well as adding Australia and New Zealand as a new region. So stay tuned for those updates in the meantime. To provide you just a little, call it a brief look at what this tool looks like in each region. Each region has its own tab, and it has a full list of the types of pieces of legislation applicable in those regions, broken out by state or province or country, or even on a federal or call it overall governing body type of breakdown. Within each row, you can learn about when the last update was, where the state of enactment is, the name of the bill or act, the description, purpose, current status of it as of the last update, information on when it was passed and when it would be enforced if it had been, the type of regulation that it falls under, more categorized based on like if it's a fee or tax, such as like an EPR bill, or if it's a ban, such as a PFAS ban, things like that will be represented there. And then if there's any, then there is kind of a breakdown of the implications or how these bills could be impacting the pet industry more specifically. If we have any if there's any implication for any on-pack label changes, such as the marketing or the use of certain language on a label, there will be a yes next to that within that column. And then there's a whole section regarding the type of business likely impacted and broken out by within the pet supply chain. So we have packaging suppliers, durable good brands, food brands, distributors, and retailers. And out of the conservative nature of some bills being a little, I guess you could say, being sorted out through in the moment, there are some moments where there is a yes given, although it may not be actually definite as rulemaking is happening or definitions are still being figured out. So do not panic, I guess, if you see yes for every single bill that applies to your part of the supply chain. It may not actually be applicable, just more cautiously, yes, it could be. And then we finally have some information regarding the type of packaging that this bill is targeting. More or less, there are a lot of bills or regulations targeting really all types of packaging, both primary and even secondary and tertiary, but there are some ones that are more focused on paper or flexible plastic or rigid plastic and so forth. And so that will be provided in this section as well. And if there's any information or any concern for how or what to do about reporting or who to report to, how much to report to be paying for fees or taxes and so forth, there's a whole section, if applicable, that will at least guide you in the right direction, providing information on such as the Circular Action Alliance being the PRO for several states in the US, at least for EPRs, and links provided there. Notable exclusions are mentioned in case it applies to the size of the company, the type of the product that it's being housed in. Really, anything that seemed applicable to the pet industry will be mentioned there, and any recent updates that have happened in the last, say, 6 months or upcoming to keep in mind of. Through that, you can understand, or you can at least kind of get a gauge of what is more prevalent in the last several months and what to keep in mind for, especially if there's certain bills that had just recently been passed, but you don't exactly, they're still working out the enforcement or the rulemaking stages. You can understand some more details there. And then bear with me just a couple more sections here, at least to point out, if you really would like to put on your legal hat and look further at the true legislative document, we have those linked with each bill or regulation. And then where you can track updates. As I mentioned before, this is updated on a biannual basis. So while I wish we had this updated, it was really as up to date every single day. There are links provided to at least find ways of bridging that gap, understanding what's happened in the last couple months, for instance. And any supporting information regarding, such as like a covered materials list or preliminary findings from a characterization study. those links are provided as well, as it pertains to that row, which is the bill or piece of legislation. The same view you'll find for all the different regions as mentioned before. And there is a glossary in case you have some questions about what we mean by certain terms. I do, of course, understand that this is a lot of information. We have over 100 pieces of regulations across all 4 regions represented here. So with that being said, I do encourage you at least to fiddle around with it using a temporary view. You can create filters and sort to understand or really, whittle down the list to hopefully not be as overwhelming. But yes, anyway, I am very excited to be talking about this tool today, at least just launching it. I think it was a huge feat to really create, and I'm very excited to be providing it to our PSC community today. But as I said, very overwhelming. And I think it's the perfect time to be handing it off to our root team today to talk about how a lot of this, what's really the theme here, what's happening in the packaging legislation space, and really what are the key takeaways instead of being so bogged down by my information overload there. So I'll hand it off to you guys.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ali. And good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you're dialing in from. Really great to be joining the PSC team again. I'm Tracy. I'm the founder and the director of Root, and I'm joined by the incredible two-lady team of Sarah Jane Widdowson, who's our global waste management and policy lead, and Hannah Jane, just giving you a new name, Hannah Worthington, who's our impact and policy lead, and very much down into the nitty-gritty of the detail. Really, really pleased, as I say, to kick off the session today. What I'm going to do is we're going to spend a little bit of time. I'll give you a very brief intro to the company, which will take about 30 seconds, and then we'll dig into the nitty-gritty of the session today. So Hannah, if you could just bring up the deck, that would be fantastic. Excellent. So for those of you who don't know us, we're very much the trusted advisor for sustainable packaging. We very much look to develop impactful partnerships with global brands and packaging producers to help them mitigate risk and become responsible leaders. And we deliver world-class advisory, strategy, impact and regulatory support. You can head to the website. Maybe I'll get Hannah just to put a reference to the website in the chat if you want to find out more about our fantastic team's expertise, but also the different regulatory services that we provide. And we've got over 65 years, that's probably a few more than that by the time we've calculated up the years this time. Today we've got over 65 years of experience on the team across the full life cycle of packaging, from design and innovation through to manufacture, reuse and end of life. And we're also supported by Design for Life, which is our unique methodology. It very much is infused into every single piece of advice that we give and every project we deliver. And as you can see, we work with some really, really fantastic brands, a few in the pet sector as well. So before I move on to the hand over to the fabulous Sarah Jane, I think it's really important to recognise the work and the effort that's gone into the tool that Ali and the team have created. So well done, Ali, and the PSC team. It's a really fantastic start. And I think what's really interesting for us is seeing how the landscape of the packaging regulation has changed beyond recognition, especially since I entered the packaging industry 25 years ago. And regulation was kind of there, but there wasn't a huge amount of work that people needed to dial into and to keep on top of. So it's very much changed a lot. And what we find is that a lot of our calls with clients around packaging regulation, they tend to feel a little bit like a therapy session initially. It's a case of, well, where are we supposed to start? We've got one client, we've got these regulations in this country, we've got this coming in, and how are we supposed to make sense of it? So the first point, the great work that the PSC team have created, done by creating that Excel and that database, is really useful because it gives you the starting point to really understand how you're impacted. And the work that we do is very much helping brands take the detail of the nitty-gritty and help them understand what are the priorities that they need to be focusing, because there's so many different ones. Is it carbon? Is it water? Is it recyclability? Is it lightweighting? Lots of different things. And also, how do they prioritize those? Which is the most important? Should it be carbon or should it be single use? We've got plastics taxes. What's the commercial impacts? It's really important to try and make sense of all these different things. So today what we're going to do is very much hold your hand and take you through the global and then the packaging and packaging waste regulation, which is the key sort of environmental European rather regulation. And we'll also help you understand some key steps to take. We'll try and make it a little bit shorter than because we've run over by just a few minutes. So yeah, if you can pop on to the next slide, Hannah. And I will hand over to the wonderful Sarah Jane Widdowson to really sort of set the scene and help us understand what's going on at that global level and how does policy really work when it comes to packaging. Over to you, Sarah Jane.
Lovely, thank you very much. So, as Tracy was saying, the global policy space is an incredibly fast-moving environment currently. And it's fantastic to see so many pro-environmental policies coming forward, but also frustrating to see so many similar policies are being implemented differently, depending on which country or state you're doing business in. So it's really important to dive into the detail and get a thorough understanding of your compliance obligations to reduce your business risks. And it looks as though PSC have really helped you with this with their database. However, I think it's really helpful to take a step back and see the bigger picture so that you can understand the direction of travel and think about where different governments are trying to get to. So let's dive in. Fantastic. So what's the key themes? So the first one, brands and producers are in the front line. More responsibility is being placed on them to make sure that they take full responsibility for what's placed onto the market. Brands are having to consider the full life cycle of their product or pack, from design through to use, through to end of life considerations as well. Number two, the core aim of all of these policies is to safeguard resources and to reduce waste. Year on year, the amount of waste we produce is increasing. And when we throw this away, we're losing really valuable materials, which is bad for the environment, but actually bad for a bottom line as well. And then number three, many countries are feeling the pinch and governments are looking for alternative means of raising revenue streams. For some, it's about filling budgetary holes. The UK plastics tax is a good example of this, but for others, it's about raising money to invest in system change and help to drive performance in waste management and resource recovery. So let's look at some of the key themes coming from Europe as one of the leaders, which are being replicated across other countries and states. Fantastic. Okay, so European policies are at the top of the agenda, and the PPWR that Hannah is talking about is no exception, as well as updating the EU legislative framework for packaging and packaging waste. It's also an integral part of the European Green Deal and the Circular Economy Package. The Green Deal was launched back in 2019 to implement the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal targets, and it contains a package of measures to protect the natural habitat, and be good for people, planet, and the economy. PPWR is also fully in line with the EU environmental and waste legislation, which covers a wide range of areas, which I'm going to touch on, from the reduction of the impact of certain plastic products in the environment through to chemicals regulations such as REACH. It also complements Commission proposals for regulations on waste shipments, eco-design requirements for sustainable products, which are due imminently, and the policy framework on bio-based and biodegradable and compostable plastics. So really, the EU is thinking systemically across a number of different areas. And I wanted to touch on those areas briefly so that you can understand the types of themes that are being implemented. So the first one, on-pack labelling for recycling. This is really about making sure that residents have a clear understanding of what they need to do at end of pack life. So which bin does it go in? There's progress on this in a number of different countries around the world, and there's actually a mix of mandatory and voluntary systems, which can make it quite complex if you're selling your pack into a number of different countries around the world. But watch this space, because I think things are moving towards harmonisation. Reuse and refill is about moving away from single use and focusing on consumption reduction. It's a hot topic in the EU at the moment, with a focus really on the hospitality sector. So thinking more focused, taking a more focused approach on reuse there. Recyclability, optimizing this has been driven primarily by EPR. Many schemes have modulated fee systems that drive eco-design, but actually the important function of this, of increasing recyclability, is making sure that things can be recycled at scale and in practice as well. So you're getting those economies of scales to make sure that you can really extract the resource that you need from those valuable materials. Packaging materials and chemicals. This is coming under increasing scrutiny in Europe, but I think it's actually the US that is leading the way in this area, particularly around PFAS. And I know Europe is watching very closely about the developments in the US. Minimization and excessive packaging. Hannah will touch on this in terms of the PPWR, but countries around the world have been looking at this, both in terms of reducing their fees under EPR systems, but also for excessive packaging. Countries like China have been focused on very specific products, things like mooncakes, which are a part of a specific festival in China, trying to reduce the excess packaging around that. Material and format restrictions are often combined with approaches such as the Single-Use Plastics Directive, where you may get format restrictions or format bans such as plastic cutlery or single-serve formats as well. Green claims is an incredibly hot topic at the minute, with lots of regulators focusing on the claims that big brands are making and whether they are clear for the public and the public understands whether to believe the claims or not. Extended producer responsibility I'll come on to shortly, and then reporting and declarations. With all of these pieces of regulation, there's an increasing onus on the collection of data and the reporting of data. So really important to think about your back office systems to support this. So those are the broad themes that are coming out, mainly out of Europe, but are being adopted by many countries around the world. Just going to dip quickly into two themes before passing on to Hannah. Producer responsibility or extended producer responsibility. Lots and lots of countries are looking at this at the minute, or in the process of implementing it. And within Europe in particular, are in the process of trying to harmonise approaches so that it's easier for businesses to do business across Europe as a whole, instead of trying to cope with individual systems. Factors that impact fees. So you can reduce fees if you're considering the weight and the volume of your packaging, how recyclable it is, and also what labels you're putting onto your packaging as well. So some countries have modulated fee systems, such as France, where you can get bonus points for providing really good labeling or QR codes on your packaging, and you get points taken away if you are putting a pack format onto the market which isn't readily recycled. Producer responsibility, though, we're already looking to the future, and there are discussions at an EU level, particularly around increasing the amount of reuse and what financial incentives can be incorporated into EPR for that. Thinking about carbon as a metric as well, and also, importantly, thinking about biodiversity as well. So the goal really is to promote recyclable packaging, minimise that packaging, and making sure that producers pay for the true cost of waste management. So full life cycle there. And then just briefly, plastics tax. Again, this is on the rise in Europe. The UK introduced their plastic tax in 2022, and both of these came out of Brexit effectively. So the UK leaving the EU left quite a big budgetary gap. Factors that increase the tax are the percentage of virgin plastic in your product. So the driver here is to replace virgin plastic with either bio-based or recycled plastic, depending on the country. Factors that might also decrease the tax in the future: reuse, recycled content, bio-based content, but also weight reduction as well. As I said, this is live in many EU nations. Some are paying the fees out of this to Europe out of their own coffers, but increasingly countries are looking to push that back onto brands and producers so that they're paying this tax themselves. Thank you. It's a whistle-stop tour.
Thanks very much, Sarah Jane. A very exciting one. Without further ado, I will hand you over to the wonderful Hannah Worthington to give you the, I think it's the TLDR. Does that sound very old? The short version of the packaging and packaging waste regulation. Off you go, Hannah.
Well, thanks, Tracy. So just to start with the status of the PPWR and where it's up to, it's gone through a very rapid but long development process. There's a lot of bureaucracy in Europe when it comes to developing such encompassing pieces of regulation. And unfortunately, or fortunately, it depends which side of the argument you're on, there has been an election period that is ongoing at the moment, which has stalled it until November. So in November, there'll be a final vote, which hopefully will be nothing more than a formality, that will put this final draft of the regulation through into EU law, and then there'll be a transition period of around 18 months where all of the nations will start to put into their own national legislation the measures that are required from the European piece of legislation. So those of you familiar with how policy works in the US, it's very similar to kind of federal level policy where every state has to enact it separately. So the purpose of this, you'll see that these themes are coming through based on what Sarah Jane's just spoke about. It's very similar around the world, that the purpose is the same. It's the implementation that is different. But the goal is to harmonise fragmented rules and vague requirements. First and foremost, anybody who has been trying to handle anything that is like single-use plastics, so if you're I don't know, like sanitary wipes for dogs. I was just thinking of some conversation we've had recently. The Single-Use Plastics Directive will have been a bit of a issue for you because you've had to label your packaging differently. And in every nation, that piece of policy, which was a directive rather than a regulation, so they're two top-level differences, was implemented differently in every country. So the purpose of this being a regulation is that every country has to do the same thing, which will make things hopefully much easier to deal with, especially if you're an importer. The second goal of this was to reduce virgin material use with a particular focus on plastic. This is primarily to reduce impacts, as Sarah Jane mentioned, with the Green Deal, but also to reduce the amount of waste that waste management companies are having to deal with to prevent the bales being exported abroad where they may not be managed within European standards. There's also the reduction of impacts of packaging for its whole life cycle and keeping those materials in use for longer. A lot of packaging designers will focus on end of life and designing for recyclability, but actually 80% of the pack's impact will be decided at the design stage. So designing packaging well and responsibly is something that this piece of legislation is promoting. There's also the scale up of circular infrastructure for reuse and recycling. We know a lot of investment is needed to manage the volume of materials that are being created in Europe. And without certainty from regulators, investors can't invest without any certainty and can't put that infrastructure in place ahead of time. So this is giving those who are building the infrastructure a solid roadmap. So you know, I need to be compatible with this type of standard and this piece of infrastructure in this country by this date. So it's really giving that certainty. And then there's the final goal of ensuring all packaging is recycled in practice and at scale. There's a lot of recycle ready or technically recyclable packs on the market, but this piece of regulation is really making sure if you're claiming that your packaging is recyclable, it can actually be collected, sorted and reprocessed into something of value by the majority of consumers within Europe. So a lot of these priorities you'll see are mirrored And I'll just quickly go through them. So there's labeling. I know questions come in about green claims, which we can cover off at the end, but it's really making sure that consumers know what they're doing with the pack and they know what's in their hand. So the information that is available to them is clear, concise, and understandable by all. So it's a big focus on accessibility. There's recyclability, and I'll cover off in the timeline, which is the next slide, what that actually will mean for what you're planning. Recycled content, this is particular to plastic packaging. So it's making sure that there is this secondary economy for plastics rather than focusing on extracting virgin resources. Minimization and excessive packaging. This is a key issue in some industries, not so much in the pet industry, but it's making sure that the packaging that is used is appropriate to protect the product properly. It's a lot of P's. But it's not excessive and it's not going to be wasteful. Because that will have knock-on effects for, carbon, for example, shipped air, and making sure that we're using resources as efficiently as possible. There are some restrictions on formats, so certain bans, especially things we've seen in the past, things come in like oxo-degradable plastics were banned in the majority of countries because the science said they were problematic. And we've seen that there is a range of single-use plastic formats that are restricted. We go into more detail about the full list of those in our report, which I think has been posted in the chat. Reuse and refill. There are certain industries that have been mandated that they need to provide reusable packaging to customers. The one requirement that may impact the pet sector more so than others is the requirement to have transport packaging or B2B packaging as reusable, which they are quite strict targets, which will be set in the technical standards for what that actually looks like will be set in the future. Chemicals in packaging, PFAS being the big one. Especially in paper-based packaging, we know a lot of grease-proofing agents can contain PFAS, so it's ahead of time making sure that you're proactively removing the PFAS. And then there's compostable packaging, ever controversial for waste managers and marketeers. There's the use of compostable packaging is going to be restricted, so it can only be used where it's beneficial for the environment, a reusable or recyclable, mechanically recyclable or packaging-free alternative is not available, and where it increases the collection of organic waste or is beneficial to prevent the contamination of other waste streams. So there are some strict requirements on that which have been published in the legislation as well. I'm sure we'll get plenty of questions about that towards the end. Just come a little bit aware of time, I'm just going to squiz through here. So this is a timeline. Unfortunately, the formatting seems to have gone a bit funky here, but stick with me. So this is a timeline of what it looks like currently. It's expected as per the draft in April 2024, assuming a date of November 2024 to be transposed. And there is this 18-month transition period. The way that the timings are set up is that there is usually either X amount of months from transposition, so say 2 years after the legislation is live, this requirement will come in, or it'll be, say, 2030, and it's whichever of those dates come latest to prevent regulation coming out too close together and businesses not being able to adapt to it. So there'll be primary regulation, which is what we expect in November, and then there will be implementing or delegated acts. So these pieces of secondary legislation, there's expected to be about 40 of them, will set specific rules for specific parts of the regulation. So if we look at recycling, so over 2027, 2028, we have the design for recycling implementing legislation. And what this will do is show the methodology and how you assess your packaging to be recyclable. Each piece of packaging will need to come with a declaration that says that we are compliant with all of these pieces of secondary legislation. Recyclability, minimization are the two key ones. And then you'll see for 2030, packaging will be should be recyclable, and then by 2035, the packaging must be recycled at scale. So you have 2 to 3 years to adapt to this regulation coming in and the guidance to change your packaging over. Now we know that packaging can take 2 or 3 years to change over, so preparing in as far in advance as possible. We know some of the themes have been spoken about of what recyclable packaging will look like. We know that there is guidance available today from recyclers on what they consider to be recyclable. So preparing sooner rather than later is always recommended. And then I'm going to pass over to Tracy for how to prepare for this legislation.
Super, thank you, Hannah. And one of the key messages that I really wanted to hit home, and I think a lot of people on this call, because of the great work that the PSC does, they'll know that compliance isn't enough. And one of the real challenges of the legislative landscape changing and being so complex is that what we see is a lot of clients aren't able to do enough of everything. They can't afford the costs to cover all of the markets that they need to stay on top of, which is why the tool's really useful. And they also recognize that some of the changes that they're not able to make because they're actually needing to funnel and focus a limited amount of resource or a limited amount of expertise into actually staying on top of the regulation. So that's why a lot of our work is very much focused on sort of simplifying, pulling out the key themes and really understanding what those big priorities are. What we also find with really just in businesses reacting to compliance is they might just be reacting to some design guidelines that might be from the fibre sector, or they might be looking at some work that another trade body has done that is specific to flexible packaging, for example. And the challenge is that this sort of more reactive approach to packaging means that you'll be investing in, on 2 or 3 year cycles, and it's even less than that because of each of the different countries is working at different rates. So what we always really strongly recommend to people, and we'll just cover it off briefly in our recommendations, is to really think longer term and really look to have some clear strategic priorities in place for your packaging so that you don't get distracted and commercially sabotaged by responding to regulation on a regular basis. Thanks. So some of the questions that came in prep for today were really great questions. There are some key themes. I haven't picked up on all of them here, but we've got a couple of case studies if we've got time to chat through. A lot of people don't really know where to start because they've got what we're recognizing. There's definitely this key theme that we need more data, as Sarah Jane and Hannah were saying. So we need to understand more from suppliers. We need to understand more about the raw materials, where they come from, how they're processed, where they're produced, their recyclability of them, and a whole load of other data points. And it's really difficult because some suppliers don't know a lot about the packaging that they produce. I think it's quite safe to say, and it's quite common to have poor data. And just tying in the question around green claims, it's really difficult to make a claim that you can be confident about going out to the market, especially when there's lawsuits firing out left, right, and centre. It's really difficult to make a claim about something if actually you're not really sure or certain that the information that you've been provided about the recyclability or something, or the recycled content, or whatever else about a bio-based material, etc., or the compostability of something. There's lots of it's just very, very difficult. So what we definitely need, one of the first steps that is really important is for you as an organization, whether you're a brand or a producer, is to be really clear about what your obligations are. So the tool, I think, is a really fantastic start for that. And as Ali was showing you, there's lots of different options that you can filter to really understand sort of what applies to you. There'll be things about size, scale, tons that go on the market, etc., in terms of producer responsibility, and what your role is whether you're a retailer or you're and how the product is retailed, etc. And I think it's really important as well. So when you've got your strategic priorities clear, once you proliferate them into the industry, it really helps packaging suppliers and raw material producers understand what it is that they need to innovate towards, where they need to put their packaging spend, and also really hitting home this whole message that it's really important for you as for the brands that are on the call, but actually for producers who are buying in packaging material and converting it, to really to make sure you've got your own priorities, but for you to prioritize suppliers that can give you good data. And I've used the word, as I was typing it in, it's a bold word to say can guarantee good data. But it's really important because if you want to make a claim, you need to be able to evidence it. You need to be able to prove in some way, shape, or form. There's lots of different arguments as to what level is required or what's needed, but you need to be able to prove by some sort of form of certification, evidence-based, third-party certified piece of information. You need to prove the claims that you want to make on pack. So lots of data that needs to be homogenized and simplified, and you need to get really good partners on board, and you need to use your reputation and your role as a brand in terms of purchasing power to drive forward the right action from producers and suppliers. Thanks, Hannah. On to the next one. So how to prepare? Three reasonably straightforward steps. I wanted to keep them quite high level because I wanted it to apply to as many people as possible. So the first thing is really, so you've got the legislative tool, which is brilliant. So it's really important to then cross-reference that to your portfolio of packaging and components, and also products as well, to identify which ones carry the highest regulatory risk across different markets. We know we can't do it all. Nobody can. Even the biggest global brands can't do it all. They need to set a clear plan in terms of prioritization. So really carrying out that exercise to evaluate the portfolio is really important. We do it with our packaging audit, and we've also got our impact analysis tool, which is different levels of complexity and detail, which ultimately is really understanding. We did a fantastic piece of work for Diageo some time ago, which was looking at 160 items and really dividing those 160 SKUs into things they needed to remove, things they needed to refine and adjust, and then things they needed to completely redesign. So it's this really simple way of understanding how do we splice a very large number of SKUs in many instances, and where do we act first. The second thing is about cost. It can often be the missing link, which we do find quite surprising still sometimes. But whether it's through an EPR partner or somebody else, carrying out a cost modelling exercise related to extended producer responsibility, plastics taxes, for example, what's the impact of all these different pieces of legislation from a commercial point of view on your packaging? Because actually, if you are able to remove it and you remove those fees, if you're able to then drive the demand and elevate its requirement to go into look into reuse and refill, it's a really good to have the commercial evidence base. So really important to make sure that you're combining the regulatory with the commercial. It's very, very common that they're addressed in silos, which can be a real pain. And then finally, making sure that you've got a packaging strategy. That's a lot of the work that we do, or brands create their own themselves, and we'll kind of advise or guide on it. Or if you can't go to the depths of that, if that's too much at the moment, it's really making sure that you've got clear commercial, regulatory, and sustainability priorities. So that you can understand which of your packs you need to act on fast. As we know, as Hannah mentioned, it takes a couple of years to be able to decide what changes are needed. What's the highest risk packaging? What changes do we need to make? And then you're also trying to cross over the print runs and the production runs and the supply, etc., which can be really challenging on top of everything else. So here are three key actions that we think would be really good in terms of next steps. I'm just going to check in before I talk through these. Ali, we've got 2 case studies that I was going to chat through, but did you want to crack on and go into the Q&A instead?
I'm sure we could allow like 5 minutes more before we get into Q&A, if that seems like an adequate time to address them.
Okay, perfect. So we've got one, first of all, really wonderful client of ours. It's a jewelry brand, and a lot of their packaging had and does still have in some respects. It carries a high risk because it doesn't meet existing recyclability or future minimization requirements or existing minimization regulations. Sarah Jane touched on what's going on in China, and also it meant that their suppliers are not prepared. So what we carried out was we delivered a policy summary to identify what policy they really needed to be very aware of. We carried out a root impact audit, which, as I mentioned earlier, it's a case of looking at the whole portfolio and understanding things like what's recyclable, what's not, what are the big policy risks and what's not, and where should they prioritise first. And then we also gave them some Ask Root time. So it's our advisory support, which guided them through the process, which really helped upskill them. So myself and these wonderful ladies, Sarah Jane and Hannah, have done a lot of work helping people, helping clients understand like the context and the why behind the regulations, so that they can actually follow the updates themselves. So the clients now are really clear on what the risks are that are related to them. There's some challenges around deforestation. We've been helping them with a database which helps them collect the right information. We've been helping them select the right suppliers moving forward that are best suited to help them meet the regulation. And we've also got very happy upskill clients and suppliers. Just pop on to the last one. Great. And also been working for a few years with a wonderful pet company. They had a number of different packaging formats in their portfolio, which we considered to be high risk because they because it wasn't recyclable for a number of different reasons. And they also weren't 100% clear on which sustainability priority that they needed to focus on. So we did impact analysis metrics, which is a level of analysis which includes a full LCA, which helped them understand what the carbon footprint and the water impacts were for their packaging. And we also carried out a policy summary within that to understand what the regulatory requirements needed to be. And then we've provided them with a really wonderful packaging strategy which defines what those priorities need to be. So we've built on the regulatory landscape, we've built on the analysis work, and have given them some clear priorities. And then we're just in the process of finalising some packaging guidelines, which in itself is another whole piece of work. But the packaging guidelines really dovetail quite succinctly with the plethora of challenges related to EPR and recyclability, depending on which methodology or which approach different nations decide to take around what they consider to be recyclable or not. I won't go into that rabbit hole of a conversation because it's a big one. And then impact. So they're now clear on what the big risks are to their packaging. They've got some new clear priorities in their packaging strategy. They've got a very happy upskill team who are now packaging geeks amidst the rest of our team. And they're a lot more reassured and confident about the claims that they're going to be making in the future. So with that, I shall stop or ask Hannah just to stop sharing the screen. So you've got a very large version of me on the screen now. So I'm going to hand back over to yourself, Ali, for the Q&A.
Amazing. Thank you all. That was really so informative. I feel like I'm sitting here typing my own questions to make sure we can maybe address today, or if not, maybe offline after this. But really, first of all, thank you. And I see we have about 10 minutes left of the allotted time. If by chance we can't get to every single question that we have so far, I think we can allow another several minutes after this. If you are able to stick around, I encourage you to do so, but just rest assured, this is being recorded, so you can certainly review the last set in case you have to hop off for another call or anything like that. So again, feel free to use this Q&A box that we have on the bottom to ask any questions that you have. I see we already have a few, so I suppose we should get started with the first one I see here regarding green claims, as I think, Hannah, you had pointed out before you had noticed this. So can you speak a bit more on regulations around green claims? It seems that greenwashing is relatively common in the pet space, with several companies making various types of loosely based environmental claims. Any recommendations on how to relay green claims to consumers in an authentic way?
Sorry, just a minute while I unmuted then. Perhaps if I can make a start. I was just searching a fantastic website when I saw the questions come in. So in the UK, green claims are under consumer protection law. There's been quite a big focus. And the UK government has a fantastic green claims checklist, which takes you through all of the different things that you need to consider as a brand, and actually will apply to other regulations in other countries as well. I don't know whether I can post it in the chat to share it with people, but that would be a great place for people to start thinking about actually what's possible. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Hannah, do you have something to build on that, Hannah?
Yeah, so I was just thinking about the phrase greenwashing and the intent. Now, we know that there have been a lot of high profile lawsuits in the US, especially around plastic packaging, greenwashing, etc. One thing to consider, which I think will link to another question that we've got, is compostable packaging is another high risk, I'm going to say, pack format for greenwashing. There's a lot about talk about biodegradability, etc. And in Europe, countries are starting to ban the ability to use the word biodegradable. So we know France, for example, you can't claim anything is biodegradable. It has to be compostable, and you have to say if it's home compostable or industrially compostable, and it has to come with a certification. So that was just another thing to consider, is when you're making your claims, it's making sure that you have used the right terminology for the markets that you're in, and also making sure that you have that evidence base behind it, be it a certification, be it a lab test, whatever that needs to be able to back your claim up. You're not just claiming it. And also under the PPWR, very quickly, you won't be able to claim things as like a positive green claim if they're a minimum standard in the regulation. So, for example, plastic packaging, if you need to have, say, I don't know, 10% recycled content, you can't have a big green sticker saying this bottle has 10% recycled content. Like you can't show that as a positive thing because it's the minimum. So it's making sure that when you're making green claims, you're picking your battles, I'm going to say. Do you have anything to add, Tracy?
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I think it's great that being able to claim something's recyclable, well, it kind of has to be if you're going to place it on the market. So I think it's really good that it's removing that opportunity for people to use it as a marketing tool. And there's much better things to talk about in terms of packaging and product, I think, than recyclability, which we kind of expect. I was also thinking as well, I was chatting to somebody earlier on today in Australia that was talking about I think there's a lawsuit going on at the moment with Colgate, I think it is, which was around some information people had used around the recyclability of tubes. So the geographic relevance of the claim is really important, because if you've got a claim and someone says it's recyclable in one market, or whatever the end of life is in one market, and then you take that and you share it in another market where actually that or region or where that item isn't recyclable, then you probably then you are at risk of having a claim. And it ultimately it probably means you're going to be able to say less if you're in multiple markets, but that does mean that you probably got a bit more time and budget to do the work rather than to do some marketing. So I think it's probably some they're tightening the belt, and I think it will hopefully drive more really good activity.
Great, thank you. Really, really insightful. And I hadn't realized, even to Hannah's point about the minimum, if you are meeting the minimum, you aren't, say, going above and beyond to market it. So that's really little nugget of knowledge I just learned today. So look, I guess touching on the compostable packaging, in case there are any other bits to add. I know, speaking from, call it like the US, North America view versus European view, I think compostable packaging is a very interesting topic across both and how it's viewed. Is there, have you found a difference between compostable packaging being seen as an end of life option across these two areas, or do you think everything's kind of universally heading in the same direction?
It's a great question. And you know, Ali, when I saw you recently in New Orleans, it was really interesting looking at the conversation, because I think what we've found previously, or I felt previously, was that the conversation or the understanding around the reality of compostable and end of life, and what's being invested or what's not being invested in composting infrastructure, for example. It felt like previously in Europe, the conversation was more progressed, but it was really good, because when I was at the event, there was lots more awareness around the challenges of compostable packaging. And so especially when we start to think about that evidence base, and there's case of, okay, so where and how is your packaging composted in scale and in practice? We've not, and I'll get Sarah Jane to chip in on this as well, I don't believe there is any clear investment trajectory from any government in the world whereby they're saying we're going to invest in infrastructure that is specifically for compostable packaging. There's always been this tension between the producers of packaging who believe it needs to go into a certain waste stream, which is typically, well, it varies, but it could be food waste or organic, and then the tension between the actual reprocessor who do not want it in their, that they can't sell it, it's got no value to them. Sarah Jane, did you want to add something on that in terms of your experience?
Just really reflecting on some of the infrastructure barriers, but also resident behaviour, the public, they can't often differentiate between compostable packaging and non-compostable packaging. So you're getting contamination in your organic stream, your food stream. When that organic material arrives at the treatment facility, often they have big depackaging processes so that they can take out the stray piece of cutlery that's fallen into the food waste bin, or the plastic bread bag that's surrounding the food waste. So actually the packaging gets taken out as a contaminant and doesn't actually enter into the anaerobic digestion or the in-vessel composting process. So unless you've got a very specific closed loop system where you can really guard that no other packaging or materials are going to go into that waste stream, you're likely to get contaminants. and a lot of the treatment processes just aren't geared up to process that as well in terms of treatment time. So it's tough.
Mm.
Interesting. Well, thank you for that. And I see another pretty highly voted question here, changing topics more about on the recyclability and recycled content side. I know speaking from my role here at PSC, I face this question a lot with our members. I think especially around recycled content and how it plays a role in the pet food industry specifically. Does PPWR require that packaging be both recyclable and having recycled content, or a and/or situation? Especially it seems from CFlex, which I understand is the European version of the APR, Association of Plastic Recyclers. They see monomaterial PE, polyethylene packaging being recyclable. Does it need to have recycled content as well, or any more?
So I think, yeah, I'll hand over to Hannah for that.
Cool. So yes, plastic packaging needs to have recycled content. There is different thresholds by different dates set out in the legislation, depending on the kind of packaging you're using and the kind of plastic you're using for it. So for example, PET has different requirements than other kinds of plastic to reflect the development of the infrastructure that we have in place for like circular plastic bottles. And to touch on PE, will it be considered as recyclable? And the question that Amy put in the chat around recycle ready or return to store. In Europe, there's a move to collect flexible plastic, and in the UK as part of like municipal collections. Currently at scale that doesn't exist. The infrastructure to reprocess flexibles is economically, I'm going to say, dubious at best. It's very hard to get a lot of value and secondary content out of such lightweight materials. So we know that there has been a lot of work done by recyclers and by the producers of plastic, flexible plastic packaging to get mono structures considered recyclable or recycle ready under PPWR requirements. We know that the Recyclas is one of the organizations that is helping to design the recyclable like guidelines, the yes or no. And we know that they are working really hard to figure out what it is in practice and whether chemical recycling is should be involved. I'm sure Sarah Jane though has a lot of thoughts on this, so I'll pass to you.
I was just going to add another quick comment is remember that some of these regulations are slightly siloed. So if you're thinking about recyclability from an extended producer responsibility perspective or PPWR, don't forget about plastic tax as well and the use of virgin materials. So this is why, unfortunately, you've got to sort of think about a broader view across all of the different themes, so that you're not conflicting with one set of regulations. It's complex, unfortunately.
And just to add a comment about recycled at scale as well. So if it's not being done in practice, will it be considered recyclable? There is the recycled, so there's the recyclable, the technical recyclable piece of requirement, and then there's also the recycled at scale, which will look at the collection rates of that packaging across Europe. If the collection rate is too low, it will be considered not recyclable. So it's also about whether you're labeling correctly and getting consumers involved with recycling your packaging.
Great point. Well, just to make a comment here and noticing the time. So we are a couple of minutes past, but I see we do have a couple more questions. So for those of you that do have to drop off for other calls, thank you for joining us. I'll have a proper closeout in a moment, but for those of you that have some extra time and want to stick around and see your questions asked and answered and so forth, I encourage you to do so. And actually kind of speaking on like the broad view that you were just saying there, Sarah Jane, I see we have a question here about like monitoring this full horizon of legislation. I know we have our legislation tracker, but there are so many other ways to at least piece together what's happening in the grand scheme of legislation. Are there any recommended call it places to find early indicators from other NGOs or lobbyists or any other consumer indicators that can help provide this pet industry more of a heads up of what's coming up?
That's a really good question. Definitely NGOs. I think from a European perspective, actually, you can, on the Commission website, although it's particularly difficult to navigate, and perhaps we can send a link through after the webinar, you are able to track what's coming down the line. So what is already being thought about, what's planned a couple of years in advance as well. So it does allow you to monitor a direction of travel. NGOs as well, particularly organisations like World Wildlife Fund, take a particular interest in what's happening. So their recent work around the Global Plastics Treaty, for example, they've been really involved in trying to push for more action. Unfortunately, there's no single point of truth, which is a shame, or none that I know of, I say.
Yeah, no, I would build on that, and I would also say that the work that Green Alliance, so again, it's another UK, an NGO. They do lots of work, and they're great around being material agnostic around single use, which is brilliant. We also do so if with our policy work, we do emerging themes reports. So that really is sort of looking forward to make sure. We did a report for a large coffee brand about 6 or so months ago, which really was looking at the bigger picture. So this was helping, it's a board-ready emerging themes deck, which helps help the board understand the key themes that it needed on its risk register, and to understand the different infrastructure that it needed to invest in or divest out of. So yeah, very much. It's also you can have a look at, you can find out a bit more detail on that on our regulatory on the regulatory part of the website.
Awesome, thank you. Very helpful resources to keep in mind, and we'll ensure to provide some links following this for where to get that information as well. One question I know, just kind of speaking from interactions with our members and the state of EPR legislation in the States, as well as just PPWR and as a whole, is I think trying to really get down to the question of, am I a producer, like as a wherever I am in the supply chain overall? And I think from my understanding, it's very vague at this point. It's a very gray area that still requires some clarification. But if you have any insights to at least provide some perspective, or where how to, I guess, if you're a brand or even a retailer, like how to really sift through that, I think would be really helpful to share with our community here.
Yeah, and I think this is partly down to market specifics and different definitions. Hannah, do you want to enlighten us?
Sure. So the general rule of thumb, which there will always be exceptions to, a big caveat, is if your name is on the pack, it tends to be your responsibility. That's how most of them are going. There are some which is, if you're importing into another country on behalf of somebody, or if you're a retailer, then things can get a bit more complicated. And the structure of businesses, we know that there are businesses, for example, with like subsidiary procurement businesses that handle, like they buy the packaging for them. It has a big business's name on, and then they pass it on to somebody else, and then it can get confusing. But it tends to be, if your name is on the pack, you can check with the PRO, and they will hopefully be able to tell you yes or no. But we have clients in Europe who, there are systems, for example, like France, where this has been in place for multiple years now, and businesses still don't know if they're liable or not because the guidance is unclear. So yeah, unfortunately, I can't give you a more definitive answer.
It's a good rule of thumb, though, just to think about, at least, that's helpful. Thank you for that. I see another question we have here in the Q&A was regarding reusing existing packaging. Like if you were to say reuse the boxes that Amazon uses for your own packaging, or maybe even like the fill that goes into the boxes. Would that be considered a way of reducing your packaging waste by chance, or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether this sort of falls within the kind of the way the regulation's been designed. What do you think, Hannah?
So I can only speak for the packaging waste regulation on the topic of reuse. The goal of their reuse requirements is that your packaging has to be designed within a system for reuse. So it has to be able to be collected and returned by a customer to you to be reused in the same way, or it's designed to make multiple trips around a system. However, proactively reusing packaging that comes to you that is designed for single use I think that's always a great idea and is cool and fun. But in terms of how the legislation looks at it, I don't think you would get bonus points for it. However, I have absolutely no idea how that would fall under EPR if you're reusing packaging that somebody else has already paid the fee on. So that is a can of
Yeah.
it's a cool
It's a
idea.
bit like repurposing. Yeah, we've had conversations with clients in the fiber or packaging producer in the fiber sector, whereby essentially they were really keen to talk about repurposing something or using something again as being classified as reusable, and it kind of generally isn't when it comes to regulation, I think. But yeah, it's definitely a good question to ask.
Mhm. Okay, well, so I guess it is a very difficult one to address at this time. It could be a matter of more rulemaking and clarifications provided downstream and so
Yeah.
forth. Well, it looks like we got another question coming through here. So how can we deal with reuse packaging with overseas suppliers? I think that kind of actually ties in with another question I had about that. When it is a matter of like import export and so forth, like how should you handle that transaction with overseas suppliers or even other parties that you are interacting with?
That's a great question. I mean, and I'm going to answer this operationally, and then Hannah, feel free to build on it from a regulatory point of view. I think operationally, we find that clients need to do things locally, just because of the chaos that the regulatory landscape creates. Is that things tend to work within, with one with one currency and within one geography. As soon as things start going cross boundaries, even in the UK, they weren't able to come up with the Scottish deposit return scheme system. Didn't really get as far as it was hoped, because the different nations were arguing around a whole number of things, which included what are we supposed to do when these packs go when they cross a border, because it becomes quite a difficult logistical issue. Hannah, did you want to build on that at all?
Yeah, so this is something that the European regulation is looking at within the single market, which makes things a bit easier. But as soon as you're importing, it can be difficult. We've seen reuse systems suffer from this before. It has been done for many years in the US. So the bottle bills, for example, there was a great example, I think it was from Oregon, where the producers set up a local system. It was all going well. A big brewery came in and had a nationwide distribution system, and then all of the bottles got lost across state lines and couldn't be returned back into the system. So if you're dealing with reuse packaging and it's an overseas supplier, setting up local or buying into or investing into or joining a local scheme for take back and cleaning, or designing packaging that can be used by other businesses. So for example, with like standardized formats that we see with bottles or tins and tubs. So for example, the pilots that Loop in the UK have done, they have like metal canisters that any brand can apply to. Those kinds of concepts could be something that's being considered to try and reduce having to return it back to, I don't know, your factory in China. I don't really know how a consumer would do that without a dedicated collection.
That's helpful. Thank you. Well, being mindful of time here, I do. Oh wait, let's just see if we have time for. Do we have time for one more question here? Can you share any best practices on tertiary packaging? PSC, we do work with a lot of distributors, so any thoughts you have about distributors or even like on the retail side of it would be helpful as one final question.
Yeah, I can.
Hannah, did you want to? Yeah, my headset potentially is going to die as well. Just a heads up, unfortunately, but carry on.
So I would recommend taking a look at the guidance that has been published in the draft regulations that looks at transport packaging. It only applies to certain applications, but there is some guidance there about, for example, if you're using cardboard versus if you're using plastic versus if you're using, I don't know, barrels, whatever your packaging may be. And the guidance is very much, if you're a distributor, harmonizing your packaging. So you're using standardized formats that anybody can use. We see it with kegs and some of the dry goods refill pilots that we see throughout the UK. Unpackaged is one example. Standardizing those barrels or whatever those containers are, it tends to be the best first step, but I'm sure Tracy has something to add on that as well.
Yeah, I was just thinking more so about, I recall when it was talking about opportunities for reuse, it was highlighting things whereby if someone's always is doing a return journey, where it's B2B, some of those opportunities for distributors and producers to be able to use, reuse and refill, just proactively and smartly, I think is quite important. I can't quite recall in our whether we covered off distributors in our report, Hannah, because there's the question is how do regulations impact distributors? I was trying to think of some other bits and bobs from the report that we could pull out.
I don't think we covered it off in a great amount of detail because distributors as a concept can be quite a broad topic, and how that the regulation applies depending on your contractual obligations, which is always a minor. So I would say in terms of how the regulations impact distributors, there is a clause in the regulation that is obligations of either nominated third parties or obligations of distributors or obligations of importers, which can be useful. It tends to be that you have to check everybody else's homework. So you're making sure that what you're distributing comes with the correct compliance certificates or declarations. And that all of that information is correct before you distribute it to wherever it goes. So you have that obligation to check rather than to provide any information unless you're an importer, in which case you have to source the information and do the declarations yourself.
Thank you. That's helpful. And a perfect way to end it off here. We've covered the full supply chain more or less about in the pet industry here. So I want to at least make sure that we cap everything off today, and would love to at least just kind of check with you, Hannah, and Tracy, if you have any final thoughts, any comments that you'd like to make sure hit home before we close this out.
No, I would just have a look at the link that somebody posted earlier on in terms of the full report, because that should be really useful. Don't worry, make sure that you're doing something rather than doing nothing. So yeah, that's just a bit of reassurance, I would say.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us here today and talking about packaging legislation. As the fact that we have discussed it for this long, and I feel like we're almost just only beginning to scratch the surface. There's a lot that hopefully you can take away, look into a little bit further. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to packaging@petsustainability.org. We'll also provide Root's information as well as in our follow-up, and as well as any of the links mentioned in reports as well. So rest assured you didn't have to capture them all in the chat. We will be providing that later today, as well as the recording. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you to Root, thank you to our sponsors, and we'll see you for our next webinar in the near future. Have a good day.